It began with the sound of paper tearing, sharp, careless, final. A sound that didn't belong in a place built on order and control. At Gate 37 of the bustling international terminal, the world moved in efficient rhythm. The roll of carry-ons, the faint static of boarding announcements, the scent of coffee and jet fuel mixing in the air. And yet, for few suspended seconds, every movement around the security checkpoint froze. Because at the center of it, beneath the fluorescent lights and sterile tiles, a young black woman stood motionless, watching her passport fall to pieces in the hands of a uniformed TSA agent. The torn pages drifted like injured wings before landing on the floor, trampled, unnoticed, dismissed. But the woman didn't flinch. She didn't shout. She didn't even reach for what was hers. Her silence was louder than anything she could have said. The agent, a middle-aged woman with a badge that gleamed with authority, sneered slightly, a half-smile of self-righteous confidence. Around them, passengers shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between the two women. Some whispered, others recorded on their phones, but no one intervened. The line moved back, the world resumed its motion. But something invisible had cracked open in that small corner of the airport. The young woman bent down, slowly gathering the shredded pieces of her passport, the fragments of identity and belonging. Her expression didn't waver. Only a faint, unreadable smile touched her lips, a quiet defiance in the face of humiliation. And when she finally stood up, her gaze lingered on the TSA agent for just a heartbeat, calm, composed, almost pitying, before she turned and walked away. No one knew her name. No one knew that behind the understated grace and silence was a storm far greater than what any of them could imagine. By that evening, phones would ring in executive offices across the airline's headquarters. By dawn, the same badge that gleamed under fluorescent lights would lie on a desk, cold, lifeless, meaningless. But for now, in this sterile terminal filled with murmurs and judgment, no one saw the shift beginning, the silent pivot of power, because this was not the story of a victim. It was the story of a reckoning, one that began with a faint smile and the sound of paper being torn in half. Before that morning, before the paper tore and the whispers started, the young woman's name was Amara Holt, though very few people knew it yet. To most of the world, she was a quiet face behind powerful decisions, a strategist in tailored calm, the newly appointed CEO of one of the largest international airlines in the world, North Star Air. Her appointment had been kept private for a few weeks, a quiet transition from the outgoing board, meant to be announced at a global press event once she returned from her overseas visit to London. The irony was cruel. She had spent a week there in meetings that spoke of equality, diversity, and progress, words that filled glossy brochures but often dissolved when real power entered the room. And now, standing in the chaos of an airport she technically owned, her identity had been reduced to suspicion. The morning before, the day began early. She had woken before dawn in her hotel, the London skyline still draped in fog. Her assistant had texted her itinerary: flight to New York, then direct connection to D.C., where she was set to finalize new security and staffing protocols, including TSA partnership initiatives. Her work was meticulous, the kind that required composure under pressure. Amara had been raised to carry herself that way, not because life was gentle, but because she had learned early that her silence, her restraint, often spoke louder than her outrage. At just 31, she had already survived enough boardroom wars to know that the world didn't always need to see her fight. Sometimes, it only needed to feel her presence. She moved through the airport, that morning dressed in understated elegance, a charcoal gray trench coat, hair neatly tied, a leather satchel over her shoulder. Her passport and ticket were tucked neatly in her hand. Everything about her reflected precision. But behind that control was exhaustion, the kind that came from fighting invisible battles every day. The glances, the tone shifts, the unspoken question that lingered in people's eyes. "Are you sure you belong here?" It wasn't new. Not for Amara. Not for any woman who looked like her, walked like her, spoke too calmly for the room she was in. The line that morning, The security line moved slowly. Business travelers scrolled on phones. Families corralled restless children, and the rhythm of routine filled the air. Amara waited patiently, her mind already on the meeting ahead. When her turn came, the TSA agent barely looked at her before gesturing with an impatient flick of the wrist. Step forward. The woman's name tag read R. Whitmore, a name that seemed to carry the weight of entitlement, the kind that turned routine power into theater. She scanned Amara's passport, frowning slightly. The page didn't beep the way it usually did. The machine paused, processing. Amara saw it, the momentary flicker of uncertainty, and then the agent's voice sharpened. "This doesn't look right," she murmured. The people behind Amara shifted, the collective impatience of a crowd beginning to grow. Amara offered her ticket calm. "It's valid. I just used it yesterday at Heathrow." But the agent didn't look at her. She stared at the photo, then at Amara's face, as if comparing two strangers. Her voice rose, louder now. "You said this is yours." The room went quieter. Heads turned. The words didn't need to be shouted to sting. They carried the tone of accusation, the kind that transformed curiosity into judgment. And then came the words that lit the fuse. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to verify your identity. You could be using someone else's passport." A ripple of murmurs moved through the line. Amara felt her heartbeat steady, slow. She had been in enough high-stakes negotiations to know when emotion was a trap. She said nothing, but inside, something cold began to settle, a familiar, weary understanding. She had lived her life knowing that her confidence would always be misread as arrogance, her calm mistaken for guilt, her success treated as an anomaly, the world watching. The next few minutes unfolded like a slow humiliation. The agent called another officer over. They whispered. Passengers began to record. Someone muttered, "Can't believe this is happening." Another chuckled softly. "But it's fake. Happens all the time." No one saw the irony, that the woman they were doubting was the one who signed off the very contracts that governed their travel. The final moment came when the agent, frustrated, self-assured, tore the passport in half. It was supposed to be a gesture of authority, a declaration of control. But it was also the moment everything began to shift. Amara didn't react. She didn't raise her voice. She simply watched the pieces fall, her eyes steady on the woman who had just made the gravest mistake of her career. And then that faint, enigmatic smile. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't defeat. It was the quiet exhale of someone who understood that true power didn't need to be loud. When Amara turned and walked away, she left more than a scene behind. She left a question suspended in the air, one that every witness felt but couldn't answer. Who was she? The other side of silence. By the time she reached the arrivals lounge, her driver, a man in a black suit with the airline's insignia pinned to his lapel, had already been waiting. "Miss Holt," he said, opening the door. "Welcome home." For a brief moment, her composure cracked. Her throat tightened, not from the insult itself, but from the pattern. How familiar it felt. Every step forward in her life had been shadowed by disbelief. When she graduated top of her class from Princeton, people asked what scholarship program she'd been part of. When she joined the airline strategy division at 26, they said she was lucky. When she became COO, the congratulatory emails carried that same undertone, surprise disguised as praise. And now, as CEO, she was still explaining herself, even when she didn't say a word. Foreshadow of storm. In the backseat of the car, her phone buzzed. A text from her assistant. "Board just confirmed the 3 p.m. announcement. The press release goes out at midnight. Congratulations, Ms. CEO." She looked at the message for a long time. Then, slowly, she typed a reply. "Hold it." Because something inside her had shifted. The company that prided itself on inclusion and integrity had just watched one of its contracted agents strip her of both. And the world had watched too. Through phone cameras, through whispers, through silence. Amara knew this wasn't just about her. It never had been. It was about the casualness of disrespect, the way systems train people to see threat where there was grace, and deceit where there was strength. She didn't want an apology. She wanted accountability. That night, as the world slept, Amara sat in her penthouse apartment overlooking the city lights. Her torn passport lay on her desk, carefully reassembled like a puzzle. Her reflection caught in the glass window, steady, unreadable. The next morning, the airline's headquarters would wake to chaos. Emails would flood in. Internal memos would circulate. And the woman the TSA agent accused of faking her identity would reveal who she truly was, not through anger, but through precision, power, and grace. Because dignity, when wielded by the right hands, could be the sharpest weapon of all. The morning didn't rise softly over the city that day. It came like a warning, cold light spilling across glass towers, catching the edges of something unraveling. At Northstar Air's headquarters, a tower of steel and mirrored windows, everything looked as polished as ever. But the stillness had changed. The quiet hum of business had turned into something sharper, the kind of silence that lives between emails, the kind that spreads when people are afraid to say what they've seen. The reason for that silence began with a single clip, 12 seconds of video that had already made its way across social media overnight. It showed a TSA agent tearing a passport in half, her face flushed with irritation, and a young black woman standing perfectly still. There was no shouting, no protest, only a faint, heartbreaking smile. The internet had done what it always did. The video was everywhere, reposted, dissected, debated. The caption beneath it read, "TSA agent accuses woman of faking her identity, destroys her passport." That was all it took. People argued about race, about power, about how far someone could go when they thought no one important was watching. But what no one realized yet, not even the reporters, was that the woman in the video wasn't just any passenger. She was the CEO of Northstar Air. And the story wasn't over. Inside the 37th floor of the company's glass tower, the CEO's office was still dark when her assistant arrived that morning. Layla stood outside the closed door, hands trembling slightly as she checked her messages. News alerts filled her screen. She could feel the buzz of panic spreading across departments. No one wanted to say it out loud, but everyone knew. When the elevator finally opened, the atmosphere shifted. Amara Holt stepped out, calm, collected, every movement deliberate. Her black suit was crisp, her face unreadable. She didn't speak to anyone as she crossed the floor, but everyone moved out of her way. They had seen the video. They knew what had happened. They also knew she wasn't someone who broke easily. When she entered her office, she placed something on the desk, her torn passport, carefully taped back together. It wasn't just a document anymore. It was evidence, a symbol, proof that the world could still look at a black woman in power and decide she didn't belong. Her senior team sat across from her, the legal counsel, the PR director, the operations head. Their faces carried that corporate mix of fear and apology, like people waiting for a verdict. Amara didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. When she spoke, her tone was measured, calm, and steady, the sound of a woman who knew exactly where her power lived. "This happened on our watch," she said, "at one of our partner security checkpoints. That means it's not just their mistake. It's ours." The PR director tried to speak, something about waiting for statements, about not confirming her identity too soon. Amara's expression didn't change. She simply said, "We don't react to the world. We lead it." That single line silenced the room. Within an hour, the entire company was in motion. Reports were being pulled, contracts reviewed. Every department head was ordered to gather information. Her command moved through the system like a quiet storm, efficient, unstoppable. Outside the boardroom, whispers filled the corridors. Some employees stared at the news on their phones in disbelief. Others whispered in low voices, "Was that really her?" The CEO. It can't be. But the truth had already started to spread. By early afternoon, an internal memo hit every inbox in the company. It was short and sharp. Effective immediately, all Northstar Air personnel and affiliates will participate in an internal review addressing bias-related conduct. No exceptions. People read it, paused, and then read it again. The message was clear. Something far bigger than a public relations issue was happening. Meanwhile, across the city at the airport, The TSA agent from the video sat in a small, sterile room, surrounded by her supervisors. Rebecca Whitmore, mid-40s. Her uniform was still neatly pressed, but her face told a different story. She looked tired, defensive, as she tried to justify what she'd done. She said the passport didn't look right, that she was just following procedure. But as she spoke, she could see from their expressions that something had shifted. Her supervisor slid a tablet across the table. On the screen was the video. Her own face, her own voice, frozen in time. He spoke slowly, almost carefully. "The passenger you accused," he said, "was Amara Holt, the chief executive officer of North Star Air, the airline that holds our contract." Rebecca blinked, confusion breaking into panic. "That's not possible," she said. But the truth was sitting right in front of her. By that evening, her name was all over the internet, trending, dissected, judged. Headlines blazed across every outlet. TSA agent accuses airline CEO of identity fraud. The comments were merciless. Some called it karma. Others called it justice. And yet, beneath it all, there were still those defending her actions, saying she was just doing her job. Back in her office, Amara said nothing publicly. Her silence became the story itself. She didn't hold a press conference. She didn't issue an emotional statement. She simply worked. She reviewed footage frame by frame, watching her own humiliation unfold in slow motion, not as a victim, but as a student of the truth. Every second told a story she'd lived before. The subtle hesitation when she spoke, the way authority questioned her confidence, the disbelief that someone like her could hold power. As the city talked about her, she thought about her mother, a nurse who had once been mistaken for a janitor in the hospital where she worked. She thought about her grandmother, who used to clean airplane cabins, saving every dollar so her family could live better. Generations had fought to get her here. And still, the world hadn't changed enough. When Amara finally wrote her first official statement, it wasn't for the media. It was for her employees. The email was quiet but powerful. It read, "We cannot fly higher as a company if we still look down on the people who board our planes. This incident is not about one agent. It's about the systems that taught her to see threat in a face like mine. Accountability begins at home. Ours begins here." That message, more than anything, changed the course of the company. The next day, the emails started pouring in. Dozens of anonymous reports, then hundreds. Flight attendants, gate agents, engineers, pilots. They all began sharing their own stories. The passengers who spoke to them differently because of their accents, the promotions quietly denied, the assumptions that never stopped. The floodgates were open. Inside the executive floors, the board was uneasy. They wanted to contain it, to manage the optics. But Amara wouldn't allow it. In one meeting, she said only one thing before walking out. "This isn't damage," she said. "It's exposure." And exposure was exactly what followed. The TSA began its own internal review. The airline's lawyers worked around the clock. News anchors debated whether Amara would press charges. She didn't. She didn't need to. Power had already shifted. Rebecca Whitmore was suspended within 48 hours. Her face appeared beside Amara's in every article. One woman's photo looked like a mugshot taken mid-regret. The other looked like composure itself. Amara refused to make a spectacle of her. She didn't demand public humiliation. She wanted transformation, not revenge. Behind closed doors, Amara requested a private meeting with TSA leadership. No cameras, no leaks. The details of what was said never reached the public, but what came after spoke volumes. A joint statement was released, announcing a national overhaul of TSA's training programs, with Amara Holt leading the advisory committee herself. The same woman accused of faking her identity was now rewriting the very standards that defined identity. But even as the headlines praised her strength, even as corporations reached out to collaborate, Amara could still feel something unsettling beneath the applause. The praise felt hollow, performative. The same voices that had doubted her were now using her name as proof of their awareness. Late one night, she sat in her office, the city lights reflecting in the glass. The torn passport lay on her desk. She stared at it quietly, the tape glinting under the lamplight. It wasn't the paper that haunted her. It was how easily it had been destroyed, how effortlessly someone had believed they had the right. She knew that the battle wasn't against one woman or one airport. It was against a world that still needed proof to believe her value. Her silence that day at the checkpoint had been misunderstood as surrender. But now it was clear it had been strategy. She had known that power reveals itself in moments of disrespect, and she had waited, watching, letting the world see what had always refused to. She hadn't just endured humiliation. She had documented it. And soon, the world would see exactly what she planned to do next. It happened in seconds, but it felt like a lifetime unfolding in slow motion. The airport buzzed with its usual symphony of rolling luggage, scattered announcements, and footsteps echoing against the polished floor. But amid the movement, the air carried a strange heaviness, like a storm preparing to break. Danielle stood before the security checkpoint, passport and boarding pass in hand. Calm as always. She had taken hundreds of flights before. Airports were part of her rhythm, part of her work, almost a second home. But this time, something about the atmosphere felt colder. The lines were longer, the agents seemed sharper, and the stares felt longer than they should. The TSA agent, a woman in her mid-30s, with a clipped tone and a badge that caught the light like a blade, gestured for Danielle to step forward. She did, with that same composed grace that had carried her through boardrooms and interviews. Never suspecting this was the moment her dignity would be publicly tested. The agent flipped through Danielle's passport with the casual authority of someone used to judging at a glance. Her eyes darted from the photo to Danielle's face, then back again, a flicker of suspicion forming in the corners of her mouth. The pause stretched. People in line began to glance over. Then came the words, quiet, but sharp enough to slice the hum of the terminal. The agent accused her of presenting a falsified passport. The way she said it wasn't about procedure. It was about disbelief. About how someone who looked like Danielle could not possibly belong to the title embossed on that document, Chief Executive Officer. Danielle felt the words ripple through her, but she didn't respond. She had learned long ago that outrage often fed those who doubted her. Instead, she watched, calm, poised, almost detached. The agent repeated the accusation, louder this time, drawing attention. Whispers formed. People stared. Phones lifted, recording. Danielle's name, her image, her silence. They were becoming content for strangers who would never know the truth behind what they were witnessing. When the agent demanded she step aside, Danielle complied, her face unreadable. Inside, however, a quiet ache grew, not of anger, but of recognition. She had seen this before. Different faces, different settings, but the same story. Disbelief wrapped in authority. Security officers approached. They took the passport, examined it, whispered among themselves. The agent's suspicion deepened into something uglier, the kind of certainty born not from evidence, but from bias. She claimed the passport was too new, the photograph too professional, the credentials too unlikely. Then, in an act that would ripple through every layer of that terminal and beyond, the agent tore the passport in half. The sound was small but deafening, paper tearing, lives fracturing. Gasps filled the space. Even the intercom seemed to fall silent. Danielle stood motionless, staring at the torn document, her name split in two, her authority shredded by a hand that saw only what it wanted to see. For heartbeat, no one moved. The other officers hesitated, realizing something irreversible had happened. The agent, chest rising, seemed almost proud. She muttered something about protocol, about protecting national security, as though humiliation were a justified form of defense. Danielle took a slow breath. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't plead. She simply turned her gaze toward the woman, steady, unflinching, almost pitying. And then she smiled, a faint, deliberate, haunting smile. That moment, that silent defiance, broke the room's spell. People began to whisper again, but now their tone had changed. Some looked uneasy. Others turned away, unwilling to face the discomfort of what they'd witnessed. Danielle gathered her torn passport pieces, folded them carefully, and placed them in her bag. Then, With quiet dignity, she walked away. No one stopped her. No one apologized. The agent simply turned to the next passenger, her face flushed, her hands trembling slightly, pretending that what had just occurred was part of a normal day. But it wasn't. The balance of control had shifted, even if no one yet understood how. Outside the terminal, Danielle's driver, a man who had worked for her company for nearly a decade, noticed her silence as she entered the car. He didn't ask. He didn't need to. He could see it in her eyes, that cold clarity that always preceded her boldest decisions. Hours passed. News didn't travel through headlines first. It traveled through whispers. An incident at the airport. A black woman humiliated at security. Someone important. Someone high-ranking. No one knew yet how important. By the time Danielle reached the company's headquarters, her calm had crystallized into precision. She didn't yell. She didn't weep. She simply began to make calls, not to lawyers, not to the press, but to her internal teams, the people who handled contracts, partnerships, and, most importantly, the airport's corporate account. The company owned major logistical contracts with several airports, including the one she'd just left. Billions in operations, thousands of employees, global partnerships. And now, all of it intersected with that single, torn passport. Inside the terminal, the TSA agent's shift ended without incident. But something in her stomach twisted uneasily. A supervisor had spoken to her in hushed tones, asking for a version of what had happened. She repeated her justification: suspicious behavior, unclear documents, maintaining security. Her story wavered slightly under pressure, but she clung to it. That night, as she sat at home scrolling through social media, she noticed her face, blurry, half-framed, circulating in posts and clips. The video from a bystander had gone viral. Comments flooded in. Some defended her, others condemned her. The words racial profiling appeared again and again. Her hands shook as she scrolled. By morning, her phone was buzzing nonstop. Calls from superiors, emails marked urgent. The agency had been contacted by the airline's corporate office, specifically the CEO's team, requesting an immediate investigation and suspension pending review. She didn't understand. How had the airline CEO become involved so quickly? It wasn't until the memo arrived that the full picture emerged. A memo with the company's seal, bearing the CEO's signature. The name at the bottom stopped her cold. Danielle Richards. Her mind raced back to the woman at security, the one whose passport she had destroyed, the one she had accused of lying about her identity, the one who had smiled. Her breath caught. The floor seemed to tilt. Every assumption she had made, every word she had spoken, every motion of superiority, it all collapsed into realization. Meanwhile, in the executive office overlooking the city skyline, Danielle sat alone, watching the morning light reflect against the glass. She wasn't vindictive by nature, but this wasn't about revenge. It was about consequence, about accountability. She knew the cycle well, how apologies came only after exposure, how people called for empathy once reputations were on the line, not when dignity was. She wanted to make this moment mean something beyond personal retribution. By noon, the investigation was already underway. News networks picked up the story. The phrase racial profiling at airport flashed across screens. The agency scrambled to manage the fallout, releasing a statement about regrettable misunderstanding, policy review, and unintentional procedural error. But words couldn't mend what the world had already seen. Within 24 hours, the TSA agent's badge was suspended pending termination. Her name, once just another on the roster, now circulated in every executive circle connected to Danielle's company. Her career, built on control and authority, crumbled under the weight of a single decision. Danielle, meanwhile, said little publicly. Her silence was louder than outrage. She continued her work, attending meetings, responding to investors, carrying herself with the same calm precision as always. But those who knew her could sense the shift, the quiet steel in her presence, the unspoken promise that this was only the beginning of something larger. Behind the scenes, her company initiated new diversity and inclusion training programs across their partner institutions, including airport authorities. It wasn't for publicity. It was systemic correction, a ripple effect that started with one act of disrespect and expanded into real reform. For the agent, the days that followed were a blur of regret, fear, and disbelief. She replayed the moment over and over, realizing the ease with which she had justified cruelty. The look on Danielle's face, calm, unbroken, knowing, haunted her. That faint smile had been the last image she saw before her entire world inverted. And somewhere deep down, she understood why Danielle hadn't shouted, hadn't argued, hadn't fought. Because she didn't need to. The truth had already been watching. By the end of the week, headlines around the world told the story. Black CEO humiliated at airport, responds with poise, not fury. Editorials analyzed it. Talk shows debated it. And ordinary people, scrolling through their feeds, felt a mix of anger and awe. They weren't just reacting to the injustice. They were reacting to her restraint, her unshakable grace in the face of arrogance. For Danielle, the incident was more than personal insult. It became a mirror reflecting how easily power could be weaponized, how quickly respect could dissolve when prejudice entered the room. But she also understood that stories like hers weren't isolated. They were systemic, repeated quietly in offices, classrooms, checkpoints, anywhere assumptions stood taller than truth. And so, when her communications team asked if she wanted to issue a statement, she agreed, but with one condition. It wouldn't be about her. It would be about everyone who had ever been dismissed, doubted, or degraded for simply existing in the wrong skin. The statement, brief and piercing, ended with a single line that echoed across platforms. Dignity doesn't need permission to exist. Days turned into weeks, and the noise around the incident began to fade, at least on the surface. News cycles shifted to fresher outrage, social media found new targets, and public memory moved on with its usual haste. But underneath that fading chaos, something much quieter, deeper, and more permanent had taken root. Inside the airport administration offices, everything had changed. Meetings grew tense. Memos became cautious. Words like sensitivity, bias training, and public accountability filled rooms that once cared only for efficiency and profit margins. Executives who had once dismissed such terms as corporate fluff now spoke them with trembling sincerity. The terminated agent's case became a textbook example of what not to do, discussed in HR seminars, dissected in training programs, and cited in internal reviews. Her name, once a badge of authority, now represented a cautionary tale. For Danielle, however, the healing didn't come from seeing another person punished. It came from watching how truth, when revealed without anger, could rearrange an entire system. She hadn't needed to fight loudly. Her silence, her composure, had been a weapon no one saw coming. She didn't celebrate the agent's downfall. In fact, she never once mentioned her by name. When journalists requested interviews, she declined, saying only that she wanted the focus to stay on the larger issue, the quiet normalization of disrespect. Her composure became legendary in the industry. People began referencing her in conversations about leadership and integrity. But those who truly knew her understood that calm wasn't effortless. It had been forged through years of being second-guessed, interrupted, underestimated. It was the armor of someone who had learned to survive inside polished rooms, where equality was just a word on the wall. At home, the days grew softer. Her teenage daughter, who had seen the viral clips and read the comments, watched her mother more closely now. The girl had always admired her, but something about this incident shifted her perception. She saw not just a mother, but a mirror of her own future battles. One evening, as they sat by the window overlooking the skyline, Danielle's daughter asked her why she hadn't shouted back, why she hadn't defended herself in that moment. Danielle paused, watching the last streaks of sunset fade. Then she said quietly, "Because sometimes the most powerful sound you can make is silence, the kind that forces others to hear themselves." Those words stayed with her daughter long after. At the company, Danielle's leadership deepened in a new way. She became more intentional about mentorship, not just for Black women, but for anyone who carried the weight of invisibility. She introduced initiatives focused on bias recognition, equity-based hiring, and empathy training that went beyond surface diversity metrics. She didn't want temporary reform. She wanted transformation. Her board, once cautious about social topics, now embraced the shift, not out of sudden morality, but because they could see the ripple of trust it built with employees, clients, and the public. The company's reputation soared, not as an accident of marketing, but as a result of alignment between integrity and action. Meanwhile, the airport that had been the stage of her humiliation struggled to regain public trust. Investigations led to audits to resignations. A few months later, the director of security quietly retired. The federal agency overseeing the airport issued new procedural reforms, not because it wanted to, but because the pressure of public scrutiny left no other choice. And through it all, Danielle remained steady. She continued traveling, continued building, continued living as though that moment, that tearing sound of paper and prejudice, had only solidified her sense of purpose. Yet late at night, when the world quieted, there were moments when the memory still returned. Not with pain, but with reflection. She would think about how close that day had come to being just another anonymous act of degradation. How easily it could have passed without consequence if no one had filmed, if no one had cared, and how many others, whose stories didn't go viral, were forced to swallow that same humiliation without witness. It wasn't guilt that haunted her, it was awareness. The privilege of visibility, the burden of being seen only because she held power. She understood that her story, while inspiring, was not typical. Most people like her wouldn't have the platform or authority to flip a narrative that way. That's what drove her now, not revenge, not pride, but responsibility. Months later, when the company announced its new global initiative to promote fair treatment across travel institutions, Danielle stood before a room of executives and industry leaders. Cameras flashed, microphones hovered, anticipation filled the air. She didn't speak with anger or even authority. She spoke with calm certainty. She reminded them that discrimination doesn't always wear uniform or carry malice. Sometimes it hides in routine, in assumption, in the casual shrug of policy. She said that true leadership wasn't about controlling others, but about questioning oneself. And she ended with a message that silenced the room. Power isn't proven by how you act when you're respected. It's revealed by how you act when you're challenged. The applause was soft at first, then grew, not out of spectacle but resonance. People weren't clapping for her. They were clapping because something in her words had cracked through the noise of corporate language and touched something real. Outside the building that day, protesters still marched for other causes. Headlines still screamed about injustices far worse. Danielle knew her story was just a thread in a vast fabric, but maybe, just maybe, it was one that made the others stronger. Weeks later, she received a handwritten letter in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was shaky but deliberate. It was from the former TSA agent. The letter didn't beg for forgiveness, nor did it justify. It simply admitted. The woman wrote that she had realized how easily bias had lived in her, unchallenged, that she had spent months reflecting, not on the punishment, but on the humanity she had denied someone who deserved it most. She ended the note with a single line. "You taught me what humility actually means." Danielle folded the letter and placed it in her drawer. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't respond. She didn't need to, because change, even when born out of guilt, was still change. Years passed. The airport incident faded from public memory, replaced by new crises, new scandals, new lessons. But within her company, and within countless people who had heard her story, the message remained alive. Her daughter grew older, entered university, and began speaking out herself. She would often quote her mother's words, that silence can be strength when it's the kind that demands the world listen. And every time she did, somewhere across the city, Danielle would hear it replayed on a live stream or a podcast, and she'd smile, because in the end, that was what she had wanted all along. Not revenge, not headlines, just continuity, a story that didn't end with her, but began through her. The world didn't suddenly become fairer after that day. Prejudice didn't disappear, But the ripples Danielle set in motion made it just a little harder for injustice to go unnoticed. And sometimes that's how real revolutions begin, not with noise, but with composure. That quiet strength became her legacy. And as she stood one morning, years later, preparing for yet another flight, she placed her renewed passport on the counter. The new agent smiled, verified her details, and said warmly, "Have a great trip, Ms. Richards." Danielle nodded, a calm, knowing expression crossing her face. The same airport, the same system, but this time, the air felt lighter. Not because the world had changed overnight, but because she had. And maybe, in ways invisible yet real, so had everyone who had once watched her walk away that day. Torn passport in hand, dignity intact, silence louder than any protest could ever be. Time has a strange way of filtering memories, softening the edges of pain while sharpening the meaning beneath it. For Danielle, that day at the airport no longer replayed as humiliation, but as awakening. She had learned that sometimes injustice doesn't expose who others are. It reveals who you become in the face of it. There was a time when she had believed silence was survival, that restraint was the price of respectability. But that day had shown her something different. Silence could also be power, kind that holds its ground not because it's afraid to speak, but because it refuses to be reduced. Every time she walked into a boardroom, every time she spoke at a leadership summit, every time a young professional looked at her with admiration and disbelief, she remembered the torn passport, the sound of it, that sharp rip of paper that had once echoed through a crowd now echoed in her purpose. In the years that followed, Danielle's influence reached far beyond her company. She became an advocate for systemic reform across the aviation and travel industries, urging transparency and accountability where bureaucracy had once hidden discrimination. But she never used her title to intimidate, only to illuminate. What she wanted was simple: a world where decency didn't depend on status, and dignity wasn't earned through titles. She knew how many others would never get that chance. The nameless travelers detained for random checks, the professionals mistaken for assistants, the students questioned for belonging. She had seen their faces, tired, polite, enduring, and she knew their silence wasn't weakness. It was exhaustion. So she spoke for them. Her speeches didn't rage. They resonated. She talked about awareness, empathy, and the quiet violence of assumption. She shared stories that mirrored her own, stories buried in thousands of airports, offices, and waiting rooms across the world, places where people's worth was decided before their words were even heard. Sometimes, when she stepped off stage, people would approach her, not for autographs or praise, but to share their own stories. Stories whispered in hallways, stories that never made headlines, stories that made her eyes glisten with both sorrow and solidarity. That's when she realized something profound. Her story wasn't rare. It was repeated. And that repetition was the real tragedy. The world loves transformation. It celebrates the powerful comeback, the poetic justice where the wronged rise and the guilty fall. But true change doesn't come from spectacle. It comes from consistency. It's built in every small act of restraint, every quiet refusal to bow to hate, every choice to lead with dignity when the world expects you to shatter. Danielle's journey reminded people that justice isn't always loud, and revenge isn't always the goal. Sometimes the most revolutionary act is to remain whole, unbroken, unbent, unashamed. In the final interview she ever gave before stepping away from public life, a journalist asked her what she hoped people would remember from her story. She paused, took a breath, and said, "I hope they remember that racism isn't just the act, it's the assumption. And until we stop assuming, we'll keep breaking what we're supposed to build." Her words rippled through the media. Some dismissed them as idealistic, others quoted them endlessly. But for those who understood, they weren't just words, they were a mirror. Because deep down, everyone has stood in an airport line of some kind. Maybe not literally, but in that invisible queue where judgment waits to measure you by your color, your accent, your hair, your clothes, your difference. And everyone, at some point, has held a metaphorical passport, proof of belonging that someone tried to tear. Danielle's story became a reminder that what's torn can be mended, but what's learned must be shared. Years later, her daughter, now an adult, stood on a stage of her own, a young leader speaking at a global diversity forum. The hall was full, the lights bright, and the world that had once looked down on her mother now listened to her daughter. She spoke of grace under pressure, of choosing restraint over rage, of turning humiliation into momentum. And as she spoke, she quoted her mother. The most powerful sound you can make is silence, the kind that forces others to hear themselves. The audience went still, not because of drama, but because of truth. The story had come full circle. Danielle had once been seen as a victim of bias, then as a symbol of success, and finally, as something even more important, teacher. Her legacy wasn't measured in wealth or corporate milestones, but in perspective. She had reminded people that humanity isn't about titles or positions. It's about how we treat each other when the power isn't balanced. And maybe that's what makes her story worth remembering. Not the downfall of the agent who wronged her, not the policies that changed afterward, but the idea that one person's dignity can shift an entire institution. In a world addicted to outrage, Danielle chose something harder. She chose grace. And in doing so, she showed that grace, when anchored in truth, can be more disarming than anger ever could be. It's easy to rage at injustice. It's harder to rise above it without letting it redefine you. Danielle did both. She rose, and she redefined what power could look like. Her life became a living contradiction to prejudice itself. A woman whose calmness was mistaken for weakness, whose silence became a statement, whose composure exposed the fragility of those who sought to demean her. She never set out to be a symbol, but sometimes the world decides that for you. And maybe that's why the story matters, because it reminds us that racism doesn't just live in systems or strangers. It lives in habits and glances and unchecked assumptions. And dismantling it doesn't always start with confrontation. Sometimes it starts with awareness. So the next time someone witnesses a moment of quiet injustice in an airport, a school, a workplace, maybe they'll remember Danielle. Maybe they'll speak up. Or maybe they'll just choose to see, to notice, to question. Because awareness is the first revolution of all. And for those who've been on the other side, the judged, the doubted, the disrespected, maybe they'll remember that dignity doesn't require permission. It's not given by others. It's claimed by self. Danielle's story isn't just a story about racism. It's a story about control, the power to decide who you'll become when the world tries to define you. She chose composure. She chose grace. She chose the kind of silence that changes things. And maybe that's what we need more of, not silence that hides, but silence that speaks. Not patience that submits, but patience that commands. Because dignity, once claimed, is contagious. She walked away that day without her passport, but she left with something far greater. Proof that power doesn't come from who yells the loudest, but from who stands the stillest when the world shakes. So if you've listened this far, take her story with you. Let it remind you that fairness isn't automatic, that justice isn't abstract, and that every small act of awareness adds up. Because maybe, somewhere right now, someone else is standing in that same line, being doubted, being dismissed, waiting for the world to remember its own humanity. And maybe, if enough of us remember Danielle's story, the world won't need so many reminders.